book really starts in 2006, where basically I was puzzled with the question, the research question of, we're seeing a lot of democracy emerge or sweep the world. The Soviet Union has fallen. We were seeing more and more democratization in Latin America, more democratization in Africa. Eastern Europe seemed to be going the right path. And we weren't necessarily seeing democratization in the Arab world. So while most of the world progressed towards democracy, this was not the case in the Arab world. In fact, the future of democratization, even after the Arab Spring, I maintain, remains questionable at best. And when you examine a wealth of empirical evidence or look at some of our outstanding theories on development, which basically underlie modernization and other important features about democracy, you'll see that those models, those theories, don't necessarily explain the lack of democracy in the region. So here, for example, if we just, these bars here are Freedom House scores from 1975 onwards. If we went before, you'll note that there is very little democratic change in the region. And here is basically human development indicators, which encompass basic indicators of modernization, like education, like literacy, like life expectancy. A variety of factors go into this measure that should basically tell us a little bit about the modernization trajectory of these countries. And if we simply look at the modernization trajectories of these countries, and if we had data that extended back to the 60s, you'll see that there were huge jumps in development, in human development, in literacy, in education, and things of that sort, things that we all deem as very important to democracy, but they really didn't have much of an impact on the nature of democracy in the region. One of the most common arguments that we hear about democratic development in the region is that maybe it's not so much about modernization, it's more about culture. It's more about the predispositions and orientations of ordinary citizens. And having worked on public opinion for over 10 years now, systematically and across the board, when we ask individuals how they feel about democracy, and here's just basically, just for illustrative purposes, where you ask people, democracy may have its problems, but is better than any other form of democracy, what you'll see is systematically and consistently across the board, there's a lot of support for democracy. And this is just only one indicator, but if we think that political culture can be captured by public opinion, which I believe we can measure it, and that's a debate, and I'd be more than happy to take questions about this in Q&A. If you believe that public opinion tells us something about the political orientations and beliefs and predispositions of a society, you'll see that across the board, almost in every single state, with Yemen being basically the weakest state of a democratic political culture, you'll see that there's a lot of support for democracy across the region. However, these opinions or the support for democracy is not necessarily unequivocal. You'll also see that when we ask citizens questions about whether they support authoritarian patterns of government, whether they support authoritarian rule, whether they support some of the means, the non-democratic means that governments use to support their rule, you'll see that you find significant support. So for example, again, this is basically to motivate the talk, and I'll again, just for illustrative purposes, we're going to focus mostly on Jordan and Kuwait. You do find significant support for authoritarian patterns across several Arab states. So for example, when you ask people should always support the decisions of their government, even if they disagree with those decisions, you'll see that 50% of the population of Jordan says yes, absolutely. It's important to support the monarchy. It is important to mobilize behind the monarchy, even if the monarchy is exercising his rule in non-democratic means. And compare that, though, to Kuwait, where people say no, there's very little tolerance for the government to exercise its powers in an authoritarian way to undermine some of the democratic principles. Now, for a student of Middle East politics, these results are very perplexing, right? So on the one hand, you have strong support for democracy. On the other hand, you have support for authoritarianism, but we're finding that there's support for authoritarianism in a country like Jordan, where everything is telling us, all the indicators, all the mobilization indicators, whether it's socioeconomic grievances, whether it's the consolidation of authoritarian rule, we should see far more contestation here than in a place like Kuwait, which is a classic frontier state, oil resource dependent. It's basically dishing out resources and benefits to its citizens. And what you find in Kuwait is a very lively, well-engaged, democratically mobilized civil society alongside very Wahhabi traditional social structure. So we'll talk about that. But there's basically very little tolerance for the monarchy to abuse its powers, whereas you don't see that in Jordan. So this was perplexing for me because for decades we were taught and learned that citizens exchange their contestation for awards and benefits from the state, and at least in Kuwait and maybe other parts of the Gulf countries like Qatar, for example, you see that citizens are very much involved in holding their countries accountable. So then the project seeks to answer the question, why have the citizens of the Arab world not demanded more democracy, given the structural changes on the ground and the global push for democracy accompanying the third wave? So if we look again, and I'm going to do a very poor job of summarizing the literature and existing theoretical expectations, because I want to get to my argument. But really quickly, the political culture arguments, in my opinion, whether they're couched in modernization or civil society, and my first book was on civil society, I don't believe we can really locate the explanation there. Primarily, there's a very, in a nutshell, there's a very vibrant political discourse, political culture revolving around democracy in the Arab world. If you are on the ground studying mass political behavior and attitudes, you see that. Civil society in and of itself is insufficient to explain the patterns of democratic trajectories in the region because civil societies can be co-opted. These are corporate states in many instances. So simply by trying to examine civil society on its own without understanding the politics underlying civil society is problematic. Then we get to the political economy explanations. And they're also troubling. Again, we've seen significant economic development in the region across several decades, from the 60s onwards. That economic development was not accompanied by democratic contestation, and we can talk about the sub-level theories of the political economy explanations, and we can look at raunchier models again, and here I want to emphasize, it's not exactly the case that there's been this silent bargain or this explicit bargain between states and their societies in the Gulf countries where citizens are exchanging their contestation for better awards or better benefits from the states. We have a whole set of newer explanations, the newer democratization debates that have emerged from the 2000s onwards. From 2000 onwards, basically this is the inequality arguments, as Midland Robinson and Carlos Watch basically talk about this idea of redistribution and inequality, where you have income inequalities, that shouldn't bode well for democracy. Arguably, the Arab states could be basically countries that have a lot of inequality. That's why we don't see greater democratic contestation. But the truth of the matter, again, if you look at the empirical record in the Middle East or the Arab world, where we see more democracy today, like a place like Turkey, has a much larger Gini coefficient than Egypt, right? Or Jordan, or these other countries that really haven't moved towards democracy. Now, I know the inequality arguments are more nuanced than that, but nevertheless, even if we try to analyze the mechanisms behind those arguments, that's not what's happening in the region. There's arguments about fixed and mobile assets. Again, my critique about the fixed and mobile assets literature, and the argument there is where regimes have mobile assets, or where at least the political leaderships and authoritarian rulers have mobile assets, they might be more willing to open up the franchise because they can take their resources and leave the country. Sorry, let me just walk you through. So the argument basically is in countries like the oil wealth states, because you have oil resources, a government like Saudi Arabia is not going to be willing to allow for democratic contestation because basically by opening up, the system, you're basically going to have to step down from control over the oil. So because there's oil, because there's that resource, you're going to basically make sure that your power is entrenched and you stifle or basically crush political dissent because those assets aren't mobile. So there's this whole debate about fixed and mobile assets, and what I argue is that the truth of the matter is that assets in general, yes, some assets are not, you can't move oil wells out of countries, but even cash transfers and all these other assets are only as mobile as the international system will allow it to be mobile, right? If Saddam Hussein is going to be sanctioned in Iraq, he can't probably transfer his assets out of Iraq if the international order is going to crack down on him. So this argument about fixing mobile assets, you need the element of the international system that can condition and punish where you move and transfer those assets. Otherwise, your assets stay in the country, your country can be attacked, right? So we need to nuance our understanding of all this. We can get into then also other class distinctions in terms of the political economy argument, which looks at the role of class and the role of the middle class and the poor versus the rich. This is a very complicated part of my argument that I developed at the 9th hour, but more or less what I also want to argue is that class is basically not only indigenously structured within these states. You need to think about differentiated markets and which aspects of your markets you're exporting to a global community. So in other words, I can be a beneficiary of tourism in Egypt or in Jordan. Mark can also be a beneficiary of tourism in Jordan. And he could be actually an owner of a big tourist company. I can be basically the woman who basically travels with people and gets a very poor salary, shows them around the country. But I'm from the lower class, he's from the upper class. We both benefit from that sector of tourism. So class on its own, when you think about how it links to international markets, is not sufficient in terms of analyzing then now this connection between the domestic and the international when we think about the political economy arguments and which sectors of the society are going to be pushing for more democracy or are not going to be pushing for more democracy. So I hope that's not too much out there. So basically, in a nutshell, what I say is existing theories are empirically unsatisfying. In the cases of Jordan and Kuwait, you should have Kuwaitis shouldn't be demanding more democracy and accountability, although they are demanding more democracy and accountability. This is all predicated on faulty theoretical assumptions in the literature. The idea, what I argue, is that the core theories of comparative political development hold that existing political institutions derive the foundations of their legitimacy from within their own societies, right? If you think about the states and how we think of comparative development, we look at the democratic development trajectory of Egypt, or we look at the democratic development trajectory of Jordan or Kuwait, we often basically look inwards into the state and what's going to transpire within the state to explain the outcome, the democratic outcome, or the potential of having that democratic outcome. So the idea is in a lot of these bottom-up accounts of democracy has been the notion that if a society is equipped with the tools to press for change, whether it's cultural transformation, whether it's economic resources, whether it's economic advantages, it will automatically do so. These things are going to naturally percolate upwards, and you'll get outcomes that are desirable. And this is all, again, contained in the assumption that states are autonomous, they're self-contained, they're sovereign entities shielded from international influences. So in my effort to try to diagram this for years, this is the best that I could do. So basically, the idea here is that societies shape political institutions. This is what our existing models of political development look like. Society shapes political institutions shape society. We get these harmonious relationships, and the outcome is that everything's contained within the unit of the state. But what happens if you have the disruption of this harmonious circle of life based on an external patron that mediates the relationship between states and societies, right? So, I argue that in client states, those states that are weaker states in the international arena, institutions are no longer solely expressions of society's preferences. The client relationship diffuses direct accountability mechanisms between states and societies. States don't derive their legitimacy from their own society. So the argument then that I pose here is that it's an interactive argument, and it gets a bit nuanced, so I need you to bear with me. We have the scope condition, especially when we deal with the Middle East and the Arab world, of international hierarchy. This is going to mediate the negotiations about the utility of democracy in the Arab world. And this will then shape the democratization trajectory more broadly. So what are the implications for democracy? That international clientelism mediates state-society relations at the domestic level. Democratic preferences of society matter less for the type of institutions that emerge and endure. The existence of anti-patron sentiments among opposition movements stifles democratic contestation among would-be reformers and Democrats. So let me unpack this statement. What am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say, if we think of a state that has supporters of democracy and opponents of democracy, what we might think is that the supporters of democracy are going to keep pushing for democracy and the opponents are going to resist, right? Now, let's channel in the international client relationship. Now, it's important for this society that you have international influence, right? And let's just be more specific about it. What I'm talking about is US influence, right? Let's take a country like Jordan. Again, the United States matters for a country like Jordan. You have an opposition movement that's not necessarily anti-democratic. The Islamic Action Front in Jordan is not, it's an Islamic movement, but it's basically, it tries to mobilize on some democratic tenets, and it stands to benefit from more democracy if they would allow it to mobilize. But it's also very much in opposition to the United States and to US interest in the region. So then you take so they're the ones pushing for democracy. The opponents of democracy are the groups who are mobilizing behind the regime. They're not necessarily anti-democratic. They're not necessarily pro-authoritarian as such, but they're going to be really worried about expanding the franchise to these elements that might jeopardize the Jordanian relationship with the United States. Because devastating that relationship would be devastating to the country, the well-being of the country. So that's actually trying to unpack this. So the existence of anti-patron sentiments among opposition movements, and here by and large these opposition movements are the Islamist movements, it stifles democratic contestation among would-be reformers and Democrats. I might be a very strong democratic supporter, for example, and I would want to see more democracy in Jordan, but if I think that democracy is going to jeopardize the standing of Jordan, I might just vote regime. Okay. So then the hypothesis guiding the project is that those worried, so we go back to the micro foundations, and this is more or less individual level analysis, at least on one level, is those worried about Islamists jeopardizing the client relationship with the US are more likely to support the existing authoritarian status quo and worry about the implications of democracy, even while supporting democracy. Even while they say, okay, I'm a Democrat, but I'm not going to support democracy. Those not worried about Islamists jeopardizing the client relationship are more likely to support change or regime change. Regime change is democracy. That movement towards democracy is considered to be also support for regime change. This pattern will more likely occur in Jordan than in Kuwait because anti-American sentiment in general among the opposition movement in Kuwait really does not exist. It's not strong. And again, we'll talk about the sources of anti-Americanism in countries like Jordan and Kuwait. I maintain that this is, if it matters to segments of the audience, that this is exogenously structured, right? Because the US intervenes on behalf of Kuwait in the first Gulf War, you had a whole tide shift in their attitudes against America, and they became very pro-American. They renamed their streets to George W. Bush and Washington and all of that, and in Kuwait now everybody loves America. Okay, so this is going to impact the future debates about democracy in the Arab world, even in this post-Arab Spring moment, because we still worry about the role of the Muslim Brotherhood. We worry about whether or not they're going to be democratic, but we also worry about whether or not they're going to be pro-American. And we are monitoring very carefully the responses now of the Muslim Brotherhood in a place like, for example, like Egypt. And we'll come back to Egypt, I hope, in the Q&A. So the data sources, what data did I bring to this project? I basically, more or less, we've been conducting Arab barometer data surveys in the region for some time now. So there's Arab barometer data, and I supplement Arab barometer data with data from Pew. So these are large cross-national surveys in 4 Arab countries that are in the book. There's qualitative data based on open-ended interviews with citizens in Morocco, in Jordan, and in Kuwait. These were 250 open-ended interviews, really trying to understand what people's rationalizations were and were like. And then, again, I'm focusing on Jordan and Kuwait, but the book itself, it covers cases from Morocco to Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Indonesia. So what is international hierarchy? So I'm not a student of international relations, and so Christina read a lot of this, and she signed off on it, so if you don't like it, you gotta blame her for it. So hierarchy between one state and another exists when one actor, the dominant state, possesses authority over another actor, the subordinate state. Authority is never total, of course, but varies in extent. This is David Lake's definition, and he works on this theme of international hierarchy. So let's unpack this relationship. More or less, scholars of IR tell us that international hierarchy exists or dependency exists in the world arena when countries are dependent on other countries both economically and militarily. So economically, if we look at US official development assistance between 1991 and 2006, but even if we extend this to 2010, what you'll see is that the Arab world is the primary beneficiary of official US development assistance, and that's even controlling for Iraq during the Gulf War. I mean, this is astonishing, right? I mean, some of the wealthiest countries in the world are in the Arab region, and the fact that they're so dependent on the US is astonishing. You'll see that if we did this, if we disaggregated this per capita, the Arab world receives a far larger share than, let's say, a region like Africa. So first of all, this is quite astonishing. Second of all, if you take the correlates of war data, and unfortunately this data hasn't been expanded since 2001, so we're missing the Bush years, Bush intervention in the Middle East here. You'll see that the US has been more militarily involved in conflicts in the Middle East than any other region. Factor in the war on terror, factor in Iraq, factor in the war in Afghanistan. That's sort of like an Arab, kind of like the same logic guided that one, right? Those interventions, you'll see that the US has been involved in the Middle East more than any other region in the world. David Lake also operationalizes international hierarchy by two other dimensions, which is US security intervention and also economic dependence. But what does the US military intervention look like, or the security intervention look like? You look, basically there's military personnel deployed over time in the region during this time period, and then there's deployment over time, including Iraq and Kuwait. So what I do first is that, let me show you here, I exclude Iraq and Kuwait. So if you look at the David Lake operationalization of this concept of military deployments per capita based on our intervention in, I believe, Panama earlier, but nevertheless, this is a per capita kind of adjusted ratio. You'll see that the US is more militarily involved in the Arab world than any other region. This is even while we exclude Iraq and Kuwait from the analysis. When we include Iraq and Kuwait, the chart blows out of proportion. So militarily, we're in the region. Militarily, we support a lot of these countries in the region, and they need us to support them. So I don't want to say that's only one way, it's mutual. What does the economic dependence look like in the region? So the index of economic hierarchy is based on two operationalizations. One is the extent to which your currency is pegged against the US dollar, and the number of trading partners you have outside the US. That's economic dependence on the US. You'll see that the Arab world increasingly has become more and more dependent on the United States in the last 2 decades. The only other region that is more dependent economically on the US is Latin America. But you'll recall that Latin America is not dependent on the US for its security. David Lake tells us when a region or country is dependent both economically and its security on an external actor, you have an empire relationship. Hence the title of the word, that's why I have the word empire. Okay. So this is basically what it exists. Now let's get back to the micro level. So we've established the political context, the international order, the regime sort of, the book does more of that. Now let's get to the micro level, what's going on in terms of politics on the ground in these regions. At the time of writing my book, we didn't have elections in the Arab world. So scholars could never pinpoint actual support for Islamists. I had put support for Islamists in 2008 at roughly 35 to 60%. A lot of my colleagues were going to disown me in Middle East studies because they said, You're being alarmist. You're basically, it's no more than 15%. You're trying to sell an argument that's going to carry no water, and you're just basically trying to stifle democracy yourself by putting that number out. I said, the fact that you guys think I'm stifling democracy by putting this number out there means that my argument makes perfect sense, right? I mean, thank you. Then you had the Egypt election. And then lo and behold, we all, all of a sudden there was 70% support for Islamists, so I was off. Okay. So 35 to 60% Islamist support in both Jordan and Kuwait. You don't get this in actual elections because we've never had free and fair elections. What we did have and what we did see is that Islamists were winning elections in universities, in civil society, in professional associations. If you monitored those patterns and who was voting for them and where their concentration of support is, you could easily put it. And I'm just trying to be safe and accurate, so I gave myself 25 percentage points luxury. But that's where it was. So of the main Islamist opposition movements, the Jordanian Islamic Action Front is far more anti-American than the Kuwaiti Islamic Constitutional Movement. And again, this is because of the war in Iraq when the US liberates Kuwait. Really quickly, remember the ICM is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, just like the IAF is, just like most of these Islamic movements are. And when the war in Iraq happens, the ICM is still trying to mobilize on an anti-American platform, and the citizens of Kuwait said, there's no room for it. You either have to make a choice, separate from the major branch of the Muslim Brotherhood and be a Kuwaiti national party that's an Islamist but not anti-American, or we're going to basically distance ourselves from the ICM. The ICM made a strategic vote or a strategic decision to remove themselves officially from the overall Muslim Brotherhood, to remain a viable opposition party in Kuwait at the time. And then generally you see this, basically this difference on US support on a variety of scores in Kuwait and Jordan. These are not the best indicators, but what I want to just, again, for illustrative purposes, is to show you that Jordanians are far more skeptical of the Americans than are the Kuwaitis. So you'll see that the Kuwaitis are more likely to believe US democracy promotion initiatives have been successful. They're more likely to believe that most Americans are good people. They're most likely to believe that the culture of the US has many positive features. And the Jordanians are basically almost at half or at least 2/3 of that. So why should the citizen, the average citizen on the street, care about whether or not their government is in good standing with the United States, right? And here are the reasons. Because of trade, foreign direct investment, aid, development assistance, and stability, right? You need stability. If you want to, remember, the economic stories right now, the economic challenges facing the Arab world are dire, and these are the keys to getting out of the economic stalemate in the region right now. So if we look again at Pew data, is there support for market economies in both countries? Again, Jordan and Kuwait, you have a lot of support for market economies. Do you support business ties with other countries? 72% of Jordanians, 91% of Kuwaitis believe it's very important to have these economic ties to other countries. Do you believe the influence of external companies is good in your country? These aren't the best indicators, but basically this gives us an idea about this enthusiasm for developing stronger trading ties, economic ties with other countries. So the influence of external companies is good, 60% say so in Jordan and 67% in Kuwait. Now, here's where the catch is. The US promotes democracy where it serves its interests. 55% of Jordanians believe that, and 82% of Kuwaitis. In other words, there's this keen understanding that the US is committed to democracy. The US will promote democracy so long as it serves US interests in the region, right? So if you have democracy, which yields a government that is not necessarily in the strategic interest of the US, there's a big worry that the US might reverse that democratic decision, like what happened to Hamas in 2006 when it was elected. And this really had a profound impact on how people were thinking about democracy. Which countries can Jordan depend upon the most? Again, this idea about who you depend on as an ally. 60% named US or the US ally Saudi Arabia as their more dependable ally in both countries. There's still a 30% in each country who believe the US poses a great threat. which countries can Kuwait depend upon the most? Again, 70% in Kuwait, 60% in Jordan. So again, the US is very important. Systematically, and just so I can move through the data very quickly, and I'd be more than happy to come back and talk about it, there's a direct positive correlation between those who value trade and external business ties and those who have favorable opinions about the US and Jordan and Kuwait, right? Even if you really don't like the US, you'll say, the ties are important, I want to maintain peace and stability, I want to make sure we still have access to external markets, I want to make sure the US is there to support us. There's a direct positive correlation between those who believe their economic situations will improve and who hold positive opinions, and this is after controlling for a variety of covariates and ideology, who believe, who have strong opinions, or at least favorable opinions about the US. So people are linking the improvement of their economic situation to the United States. So basically, again, the idea is that citizens who are worried that Islamists will pose a threat are going to be more likely to support the United States, support the existing regime through that way. Citizens who are not worried are more likely not to support their existing regimes. And then you find this through the quantitative variable, quantitative analysis, control for a variety of demographics, and control for this idea of fear, which is very important when you're working in the Middle East, because people, people often assume that fear might be guiding these response patterns. It's not. Economic assessments, clientelism, lost on services, basically, are you linked to the regime through these channels of patronage, nationalism, pride, and then my key variable here is anti-Americanism. The DV here, there's two DVs that I have. Again, I know I'm taking a lot of time. The first is people should always support the decisions of their government, even if they disagree with those decisions. The IV, which is a very exaggerated IV in my opinion, U.S. involvement in the region justifies armed operations against the U.S. everywhere. So it's a very strong anti-Americanism measure. So if anything, I think I'm underestimating the effect, because you will have a lot of people who are anti-American who are not going to go to this extreme. The other DV as a check, which is not here, but is basically a more elaborate measure. It's an index variable of 2 items that tap into democracy, 2 items that tap into authoritarianism, and I subtract those out. It's basically the Inglehart-Wilkes index on support for democracy. It's worked really well, but all findings are robust. So really quickly, just to illustrate this, if you look at anti-Americanism, support for anti-Americanism is always linked to less support for the regime in Jordan, more support for the regime in Kuwait. Sorry, if you're pro-American, you're more pro-regime. That's how to interpret this. If you're anti-American, you're less likely to support the regime. And if you're pro-American, you're more likely to support the regime, less likely to support democracy. If you're anti-American, you're less likely to support the regime and more likely to support democracy. So the Democrats in Jordan are your anti-American segment. They stand to benefit from access to the regime. They want to see a transfer of power, and they're lobbying for more democracy. In Kuwait, you just find the opposite effect. Again, it's structured in terms of how you operationalize this whole idea about how people are locating themselves vis-a-vis the Islamist opposition, and that's then structuring their assessments about the regime. Then you extend these findings to places like Morocco and Palestine, Indonesia and Turkey, and you'll see that the similar patterns hold where people believe the Islamists are going to pose this threat to their regimes. They're more likely to support the existing regime, even if it's authoritarian. Where they believe the Islamists are not going to pose a threat, they're more likely to push for more democracy. So what does the qualitative evidence look like? There's a chapter in the book that unpacks the qualitative evidence. I don't know if I have time to go through that right now.
Well, for a few minutes.
Okay, so just give you a rough idea. Jordanians link their support for government and their worries about democracy directly to U.S. interests. Anti-American forces were significant concerns in Jordan. The Kuwaitis linked their support for regime or democracy to their own preferences and orientations. U.S. interests were also important, but no direct threat to Kuwait. What does this look like when we unpack it? Take Bilal. Bilal is this one citizen. Again, this is qualitative, so I'm not saying this is representative, but it basically gives us an idea about how some of these patterns emerge in the findings. He says, look, we have peace and security. This is because the king knows how to work with our allies, the US, to protect us. Then when he talks about the Islamists, he says their teaching of Islam is not positive all the time. They do some good things, like they try to stop the war between Israel and Palestine, which is good. I mean, so this idea that, if they want to fight Palestine, they should go over the border and do that. They shouldn't come into Jordan and do that and destabilize Jordan. But they also want to stop our ties to the US, about the Islamists, which will be a very bad thing. So he, well-educated, University of Jordan graduate, is very loyal to the regime. Hashim in Jordan, on the other hand, he says, look, Jordan has the most stability in the Arab world. Look at Syria, look at Lebanon, look at Palestine, look at Iraq. And this idea is that where countries lost favor with the US, their countries fell apart. Jordan is the most stable country for reasons that everybody knows. The US protects us. He's not happy about it. He says the US uses us as puppets. Both our kings have been successful, and both kings know how to move the way the US wants them to. Both kings is Abdullah and his father Hussein. They have to do this to survive. And again, he's now anti-democratic because he says democracy is about letting people rule themselves. He also believes that democracy can create more equality and put people at the same level, yet some groups then will use democracy to harm the country standing in the international arena. So again, this is a major concern. In Kuwait, you just don't find these concerns. People are not juxtaposing their preferences for regime or regime change according to what they believe the Islamists will or will not do. She's worried that if the US leaves Kuwait, Iraq will attack us. Again, in Kuwait, even after all these years, and these interviews were conducted in 2006, 2007, there is this idea that if the US were to leave the Gulf region, Kuwait is very vulnerable to another Iraqi attack. There's even this assumption that Saddam Hussein has never really been killed, that he's still out there. And she says you will find this opinion among the Islamists, the Democrats, the liberals, and others, right? So very, very early on, look at the Islamists are also very much linked to the United States here. She would like to see more accountability between the regime and the people. She also wouldn't mind if the parliament reflected the interests of Kuwaitis more generally, even if it means more Islamist representation. And why do I emphasize this? The big assumption is that the debate between the Islamists and the secularists in a lot of these countries is completely structured along this ideological cleavage, right? Conservatism versus more liberal thought. And although that is true, that does exist, that's not the only thing that structures that debate, right? There is a strong liberal secular tension in several of these countries. You see some of it in Egypt, right? But at the grassroots, and where we're polling citizens, we're talking to citizens, right? Their primary concern is not whether Islamists come to power and exercise some conservative rights or exercise some conservative dictates. Their primary concern is having an economy that will feed them. And if the Islamists are going to come to power and jeopardize that probability, they're not going to support it. If the Islamists are going to come to power and adopt some conservative policies, but promise economic prosperity, you're going to see much more support for it. And so I spent some time in the book showing this and showing how the findings line up. Again, I'm not saying that the secular-liberal divide doesn't matter. I'm saying that it's manifested along these issues of security and prioritizing the well-being of the country. So moving forward, the conclusions, understanding the lack of democratic contestation or consolidation in particular states calls for an examination of states in the larger international context. Bottom-up or national-based approaches assume complete autonomy. Anti-Americanism is a key source that has stifled democratic contestation. The route to democracy may lie in addressing the sources that increase or decrease anti-Americanism across the region. Finally, where do we stand now? I hope you guys asked me about Obama's foreign policy and the Arab Spring and the citizen priorities in the Arab Spring. All right, thank you very much.
In the earlier discussion, you seem to have used almost an accepted hypothesis that the Islamists were anti-American.
Right.
But don't we need to nuance this a little bit? Yes. I mean, not all Islamists are Islamists. I mean, not all of them are Muslim brothers, not all Muslim brothers are the same. And in the context of each region, be it in Jordan, for example, the expression of Islamists is quite different, despite of the sympathy that they may have for an Egyptian Islamicist, but they have local conditions that they respond to, local grievances against the government. The demography in Jordan makes a lot of difference if you are from Palestinian origin or if you are from Bedouin origin. And then your statement as to whether I would support the monarchy or not is nuanced also by these as far as I can tell. So don't we need now to actually rephrase the argument that Islamicists are necessarily anti-American? I have a feeling from watching over the last 2 years that the reverse is taking place. And we are finding a lot of American protection of the so-called Muslim Brotherhood, but only if the United States had the choice of choosing the leadership of those people or of choosing the directions of their future movement to be given that luxury, then they will stop that rhetoric of anti-American.
So that's exactly, so here's the question, that's a very fair criticism, which basically I have blanketed or stereotyped or labeled all these Islamic movements as anti-American. But just your last point, which as long as the US can promote even leaders from the Muslim Brotherhood to be in power, we might see success, which is the title of the book, Pro-American Democracy or No Democracy at All, right? So the debate that's out now, so in the conclusion of the book, I said basically this, my pessimistic forecast for the region will shift under 3 conditions. 1, you have a change in US foreign policy, so that's why I kind of have this question mark about Obama. Second, you'll have a change in the basically distribution of pro-regime and anti-regime forces, that will shift, that will swing widely in one direction or the other. And the third is the Islamists themselves will become pro-American, and you'll have a new movement that will begin to absorb the anti-Americanism. And what I'm thinking is happening here, which is what you're getting at, is maybe it's the Salafist Socialist Alliance now in Egypt, which is now coming down really hard on Morsi and his government because they see him as selling out the Islamist cause. He's warming up to the Americans, he's protecting, he's made statements that no Muslim Brotherhood leader would have ever made 2 years ago. So we're seeing this new transformation of alliances, so it's fair to say that it's not an Islamist phenomenon as such, it's an anti-American / opposition phenomenon. So I kind of give myself, in a little paragraph at the end of the book, that opportunity. The truth is, when I wrote the book, I'm just going to be honest, I wouldn't have bet on this in a million years, right? That you'd see a Muslim Brotherhood movement in Egypt that is becoming more pro-American and winning favor. I mean, you had basically this new round of fire and attacks in Gaza, and the Morsi government didn't say a word and in fact brokered the peace treaty, right? I wouldn't have said that was possible 5 years ago at all. So.
I wonder what this means. An implication of your study is that these authoritarian regimes are even more dependent than we had thought on the U.S. because their aid, their security, and their public support is reliant on close ties to the United States. So we should see almost no efforts to differentiate from the U.S. And something like Jordan's resistance to the U.S. line in the first Gulf War or other areas where they're not entirely obedient clients are surprising.
Right, and so there, I mean, you do see some things going on. Getting back to what happens in Jordan, the first Gulf War, you see this big, massive mobilization along Palestinian-Jordanian lines. And Jordan ends up suffering drastically for not aligning with the U.S. in that first intervention. And within 6 months, they repaired the relationship, they dealt with it, right? But since then now, if you look at the way, I know this is not politically savvy to say, but I control for the Palestinian-Jordanian divide in all the analysis in Jordan, and if you look at this new economic elite in Jordan today that is mobilized behind the king, they're the Palestinians, right? So the Palestinians in the last decade have become the new business elite. They're the free trade, market-oriented, pro-U.S. segments of the Amman elite, and they're the ones who are supporting the regime. So in many ways, it's really this whole idea about the internal politics of Jordan has shifted, right? And then in the second Gulf War, basically the U.S. stationed its troops in Jordan. And that came at a very huge cost to the Jordanian regime at the time as well, in terms of its credibility. But also, Jordan received an increased support of $2 billion that year. That's resources that a country needed. Yeah. Wolfgang.
I'm sorry, I might not have the voice. So, I only come anew to the Middle East, but my previous experience with the Middle East was the Kuwait War on the one hand, and the experiences to Joschka Fischer in the Arab-Israeli War. And my first question is, how symbolic for the Arab world is Kuwait and Jordan? Aren't these two cases which have a very peculiar relationship with the United States? Secondly, anybody of us who has followed the Middle East during the Cold War knows that we had regions where we had utter great power rivalry. And we deal now with one of those elements, like Syria, where you had clear Soviet-American confrontation. Egypt, I mean, let's not forget that. So, in which way does the history of the Arab world in general and the peculiar role of the United States with some states compared to others affect your wider theory?
So, very, very fair question. So in terms of where we are today in the Middle East, especially since the Cold War, I mean, I would say by and large, almost every single Arab state is a direct beneficiary of U.S. presence in one way or the other. Jordan, the Palestinians in the West Bank, right? Egypt, to some extent, Morocco. Then all the Gulf countries are security clients. So it's really hard to say that this is only a Jordan-Kuwait story. Where my argument is it's more difficult, and I'll tell you, I'll give it to you, is that, let me just say, is that up until Egypt, we don't know what's happening in Egypt, the only country where you had a pro-American opposition movement is Kuwait. Yeah. The second country is maybe Morocco. It's not pro-American, it's less anti-American, but I'm not saying it's pro-American, yeah. But it can go back and forth, right? So that was a challenge for is that really, is this really, am I really going to structure an entire argument on one case, right? So then that's why I do some analysis. The best I could do there is going out to Indonesia, which has a pro-American Islamic opposition movement, and Turkey, the AKP, has become very pro-American, right? So that's kind of where I'm trying to get support for the argument. And nevertheless, I don't think I should have the final word on the debate. I hope other people will try to see how much this argument holds. Now, Syria was the one country that gave me the most heartache on this book. And kept me up at night because, first of all, it was hard to label. Syria is not a client state, right? And what I would have loved to do and be able to do was have Syria to be the case outside the scope condition, right? My scope condition is international hierarchy. It would have been lovely to be able to do it. We got approval to do the public opinion surveys in Syria so long as the government regime members traveled with us door to door to do the surveys, right? So that killed that project. And the truth is, up until even now, and Wolf, you can tell us, everybody I talked to who tried to work in Syria, we didn't have a clue about what opposition state relations looked like in Syria. But now, what sort of confirms my story, Wolfgang, when we talk about the opposition in Syria today, and as the U.S. has become more involved, and I know that statement is up to debate. How much are we really involved in Syria? I think we're pretty much sort of involved. Some people think we're not. But what's the key question that we're asking ourselves about the opposition? How Islamist are they? Mm-hmm. And if somebody came out and said that Islamist opposition movement in Syria is so Islamist and so anti-American and so anti-Western, I don't think we're going to be championing that opposition movement. This is the big question that we're trying to figure out. I just heard a piece yesterday that I think on the BBC that said the Islamist movement in Syria is more Islamist than we actually ever thought. What is that going to mean then? So the fact that this is the signals we're sending are going to be signals that citizens are taking in terms of how they're going to determine whether or not they're going to support the fall of Bashar al-Assad or not. And if I can get people to agree with me about that, then I think that's where I want to be on this book. Over here.
You had put up there, you'd like someone to ask about Obama's policies and for the new carry he's I think on his trip right now. Or will that be? How will that affect?
So the other big thing that what might change is that Obama might shift U.S. foreign policy in the region. I don't think that's going to really happen, but Obama has been savvy. I think savvier about how he deals with the region, how he talks to people in the region, how he handles problems. The fact that he's going to make this trip to the West Bank and Israel, right, simultaneously for a U.S. president to pay that, I think that's going to win the U.S. major public opinion, a major score on public opinion in the region. And if we believe citizen public opinion matters for how they interact with their regimes, that's going to increase. I hate to say this, so let me say this. Okay, let me just say it. If Obama wasn't seen as pro-democratic and more pro-human rights, I still doubt that you would have seen the large mobilization in Egypt that you did, right? I think at some point these key opposition movements really fundamentally believe that if they mobilized, an Obama government was not going to stand by and allow the dictatorship to crush them, as so many times happened before under Mubarak during the Bush years. The first mobilization in Tahrir doesn't happen in 2010. All throughout the 2000s, you saw people going to Tahrir Square, mobilizing and being crushed and assaulted and shot and killed. That we never really discussed in the United States, but Obama made it very clear early on in these demonstrations that the Mubarak regime should not open fire, that the U.S. was not going to tolerate a massacre in Tahrir Square. This was very important, I think, for the mobilization. And if you look at the U.S. statements, and when those demonstrations and the mobilization begins to increase, you see, okay, I can't say there's a correlation. I'm not going to say because it's not. I don't want to get into a causal inference today. But you'll see that after those statements, the mobilization increases drastically. When it becomes clear that the military itself said we're not going to kill our own people at the time, right? So if Obama is perceived as being far more pro-democracy, we might see more Arab Spring movements across the region. And that's positive or negative as you want to perceive it, because this is a region that is things are going to get a lot worse before they get better there.
Yeah.
Rafael.
Yeah, so I like your bottom-up approach to the project and your other work, but I'm still kind of wondering what the agency is of the regimes themselves. Because when you talk about the hierarchy, you present it as if this is a status quo that's not going to change, and the regimes have no say in how dependent they are on the United States. And you said some of these countries are very wealthy countries, so there's some choice involved, at least to some extent, right, in terms of how much of a client they want to be. And so is it the case that some of these regimes have this figured out in the sense that, okay, we're going to be so dependent on the United States that opposition movements and the public at large are going to know this, and that they're not going to push for democracy because then we're going to lose our ties to the U.S. and the economy is going to go south. So in other words, have they figured out that being tied to the U.S. is actually going to increase is going to make them more stable and more authoritarian?
So this is a good, so the question here, let me just rephrase it, like, do the regimes do this themselves? Do they overstate their dependence on the U.S. as a way of protecting themselves from the opposition movements? And the truth is, okay, so if you look at the book, I spend a lot of time on the international context, I spend a lot of time on the public opinion, on the Islamists and the opposition and the pro-regime segments. I spent some time about the regimes, but the truth is for two reasons. The first reason is the book got really big very quickly, so I didn't spend a lot of time talking to regime leaders, but I do spend some time looking at the pronouncements, like, official statements from some of these regimes where they're clearly saying, don't be stupid and don't jeopardize what we have. Look at our growth rates in the last year were 8%, unheard of. That's because of stability. That's because the United States is giving us this aid, so don't jeopardize this. Certainly the Palestinians have used this line in the West Bank forever, which is, yes, authoritarianism, human rights in the West Bank have fought, the condition of human rights has deteriorated, but look at, we're getting a lot more aid, right? So there's like this, it is packaged in this trade-off. But the other reason, and more truthfully, why I didn't spend a lot of time with the regime segments is because at the time that we were doing this work, I didn't want to alert the regimes that we were doing this work. So it was also a calculated thing, like, okay, let's just keep it on the down low. In 2006, you know, the researchers on the project in Jordan were arrested several times, and we had to get them out of jail all the time. So it was just like a matter of getting in and out. So so that's probably what's going on there too. Okay.
Let me ask one question. We have a minute. So, is one of the implications of your argument that in order to promote democracy in the region, that the U.S. should continue to promote power?
So okay, so no, I don't say that.
Well, I'm just wondering because it does seem almost to be a logical conclusion.
Let me say this. I think I'm beginning a new project on Egypt with Helen on the political economy of Egypt. I do believe that these economies are not going to jumpstart without the help of the United States in some meaningful way. So I kind of say the dependence is okay. I know this is problematic. So I don't want to sound like a colonialist, but the dependence. This is the way the world market works. This is the way things are structured economically. And at some point, you're going to need the favor of the United States to jumpstart these economies. I also believe that the U.S. is not going to pull out of the region. Right? As long as we're dependent on oil, and the world, and so my funny story is that as a student of Middle East politics, I never wanted to study oil because every time I went to an oil talk, I found it drastically boring, and I didn't want to hear about oil. And what this project forced me to do was understand the politics of oil and how dependent and how reliant and how cheap it is to export or to extract oil from the region. Like for every dollar we spend extracting oil in Saudi Arabia, we spend $7 extracting oil in Russia, right? So just do the math, right? And we're not only, yes, we might be becoming less dependent, but the truth is Japan is dependent, China is dependent, Europe is dependent. So if their economies in this, again, my colleagues in IPE can tell me, if Japan is having a recession, it's going to impact our economy. Furthermore, we're also worried that, we might not need Saudi oil, but the truth is we don't want others to have access to Saudi oil either. So for all these reasons, we're going to be in the region for a very long time. So I'm not encouraging it. I'm just saying, okay, I'm going to be a little bit rational here and say they're not leaving. So given this involvement and entrenchment, what's the course to future democracy? Well, then maybe the policies should shift in ways where you can kind of take away this kind of this factor that structures regime-opposition relations.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.